Thailand's Prime Minister-elect Paetongtarn Shinawatra, also known as Ung Ing, is the youngest ever individual to assume the country's top job. Let's take a look at her political career. In fact, politically, the 37-year-old is a relative newcomer, never having served in government or been elected as either parliament member or a minister. Ms. Paetongtarn formally joined the Pheu Thai party in 2021, rising to the rank of the party's chief advisor. She gained popularity in 2022 ahead of general elections, with her proposals focused on regular citizens. Her political standing was reinforced October last year. That's when she was chosen as the leader of the Pheu Thai party. Ms. Paetongtarn is most recognized for being part of the Shinawatra dynasty and business empire. She is the youngest daughter of political heavyweight Thaksin and the niece of Yingluck. Both were ousted in military coups in 2006 and 2014, respectively. Until earlier this year, she was CEO of a major hotel business Render Development, which is run by her sister. Ms. Paetongtarn is also the largest shareholder of property firm SC Asset Corporation. But before the 37-year-old can take up the post as Prime Minister, Thai law mandates that she has to relinquish her business roles and comply with rules on the ownership of shares. And for more analysis, Professor Duncan McCargo joins us right here in the studio. He's the President's Chair in Global Affairs at Nanyang Technological University. Thanks so much for coming in, Professor McCargo.
Thank you for having me.
All right, it may be dull, but it may be relevant. Let's look at the numbers today in Parliament. Okay, so her party has 300, or the ruling coalition led by Pheu Thai has 319 MPs, and she got 314. And correct me if I'm wrong on the exact numbers. So she lost 4, but she gained 9 from the opposition, which gave her 319. For those who said no, you had 145. Now, of that, 143 would come from the old Move Forward Party, now People's Party, and they took on 2 more. And then the abstentions, 27. So we look at the old Democrat Party, they have 25 people in Parliament. So we look at the breakdown of who said yes, who said no, and who abstained. Support for Ms. Paetongtarn is relatively unchanged from that for Mr. Seta. Or am I being naive here?
No, that's quite right. The vote went pretty much predictably along party lines. I think the only slight surprise was that the small Thai Sang Thai party, which is supposed to be an opposition party, all the MPs decided to go over to the pro-government side and vote for Paetongtarn, to the slight chagrin of the party founder, Ung Ing, who then has been issuing all kinds of statements denouncing her own MPs for doing this. So there's a little bit of tension within that party, but that's a minor subtext of the larger picture, which is that the MPs pretty much voted as you would expect them to based on their position in the coalition or out of it.
But if we look beneath the subtext, the support from Mr. Seta, the quality of that support may differ from that for Ms. Paetongtarn when she takes over fully, formally, as Prime Minister.
Well, I think the problem that Paetongtarn faces, her greatest asset and her greatest liability, is indeed her family name, Shinawatra. She is, as you said in the introduction, they're basically known as being a member of this family, of having a very famous and distinguished father who was ousted in a military coup and an aunt who suffered the same fate. And no one's under any real illusion that the reason why she's becoming Prime Minister is because of this dynastic position that she occupies. Whereas Seta Thaksin, although he was also a political neophyte who hadn't been an MP or a minister before, he had been head of a major real estate corporation. He had quite a serious business career to build upon and his own independent connections. He wasn't simply somebody who was a stooge, as it were, for former Prime Minister Thaksin. But most people are likely to see her in that light, and that's going to create some difficulties for her, given his, to put it politely, mixed reputation and image in the country as a whole.
Now, this mixed reputation might have been a lot more positive a few years ago. It is rather less glowing now, since he came back August 22nd last year, and what some may perceive as his machinations behind the scene, and now his daughter, who is everyone would acknowledge, a relative political newcomer.
Yes.
And he has called, when Yingluck was prime minister, he openly and perhaps unwisely called her his clone. This daughter is even younger now. Perceptions of her being his clone, that could be a huge disadvantage for Ms. Paetongtarn, even before she begins her term in power.
That's right. So Thaksin, as we know, was ousted in the military coup in September 2006, and he spent most of the time from 2008 until last year living overseas, primarily in Dubai. Throughout that time, he was still very influential behind the scenes, using all kinds of technologies to communicate with people in Thailand, popping up in neighboring countries to have meetings with people. And this is actually the fourth person that he has, in some sense, backed or installed as prime minister in his stead. So we had Samak Sontornwait, who was prime minister in 2008. He was followed briefly by Thaksin's brother-in-law, Somchai Wongsawat. Then we had his sister, Yingluck Shinawatra, from 2011 until 2014. And now we have his daughter. This is becoming a bit of a habit. And meanwhile, in many ways, Thailand has moved on. His party, which used to be very dominant electorally and effectively won every election that took place from 2001 until 2019, didn't fare nearly so well last year. The popularity of his party has fallen, and in many ways, the ground that his party occupied has been stolen by the insurgent, now People's Party, until last week, Move Forward Party, until 2020, the Future Forward Party. So this new progressive party set itself up as the party that was challenging the establishment, which in the past Thaksin had been seen as opposing.
All right, so there are 2 points we can pick up from there, and we are running out of time. But one of them would be where Pheu Thai would have been seen as the relatively progressive opposition party.
Yes.
Now that ground is clearly taken by People's, rather cheekily called People's Party.
Yes.
And up to a point, the Bum Chai Thai as well, stealing some of the votes from the northeast of Thailand, which used to be rather more of a heartland for the Pheu Thai party. Meanwhile, you've got, as you say, 4 possible, and every one of them removed either by coup, by a court order, by dissolution of the party. How is Ms. Paetongtarn her party lacking the kind of support that Pheu Thai did have in the past, herself being number 5, possibly, Thaksin 5, including 6 if she's removed. What gives Mr. Thaksin the confidence to put her forward at this point?
I think it's fair to say that he doesn't lack confidence. He's extremely determined to continue exerting his political influence. He would probably like to return to the position of prime minister himself if he could. But meanwhile, his strategy is to continue to attempt to put other people into that position. And in a sense, there's a kind of brazenness about this. He's extremely determined, but the other problem is that he was living abroad for a long time. I don't know whether he completely understands the extent to which his brand is no longer what it was, and that his daughter can't very easily pick up the mantle of that early popularity that he certainly had in the first days of the Thai Party, in the first decade of the new century. It's very hard to recover that, but he's also been surrounded by people who are probably telling him things about himself that aren't entirely realistic. So he may not quite understand what a difficult situation he's putting his daughter into.
All right, a final question here. One problem, and I think you've pointed this out several times, the result we see at the ballot box does not translate into who governs Thailand. That leaves people disillusioned. And more importantly, what's the whole point of having an election? Meanwhile, the parties that would like to be in power are just not viable election alternatives. Until we sort that out, are we looking at round upon round of dissolution, constitutional court changes, military coups, public protests? Is this the way to solve instability in Thailand? Sorry, last question.
Yes, and that's a big question, which somebody could probably write a PhD thesis to answer. But yes, there's a fundamental structural and cyclical problem here, which this latest prime ministerial changeover doesn't really help us with, because it's very reminiscent of a whole series of themes that we have seen in the past. Let's hope we're not going to continue going around the same merry-go-round as we have over the past few years. But it's difficult to see how Paetongtarn can be in a secure position to appeal to people from a highly polarized electorate when you've got a large number of, especially younger people, the generation that she notionally represents, have moved on to this new now People's Party, and she's hardly going to be welcomed by people on the conservative side of the political spectrum either. That is her problem. She's going to be viewed negatively from two different sides. So Thaksin has boosted his own base, but how he expands from that base at this point is very difficult to see.
So not progressive enough and not conservative enough.
Indeed.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening, Professor Duncan McCargo from Nanyang Technological University. Thanks for coming this evening.